you think about how few people in the world having
And they
brothers
didn't travel a lot and stuff. Even if you say that 10 or 12 kids each in London, and then you get a couple back. It's not the way our cousins would do it. You marrying your cousin here, your first cousin. They're not gonna get.
who that would have been. Her son used to come with her, but otherwise she came alone.
He come with her, but they used to always sit together.
Maybe they sat together. Carol?
Anyone? Carol Pace?
Yeah, she's in this class.
Yeah, she is.
Your mom's in this class. What do you need to do?
Sure. Yeah.
Well, Helen, I'm glad you.
How you
I
doing?
talked to, I texted Dave.
Have you been up the mountain? Have you been up on the mountain?
I came down with Matt. I rode down with him. And then I'll ride back up with Irving.
Yeah, get caught up on everything.
Yeah, I was supposed to do that last week, but it's Tuesday.
You didn't feel
I
well.
had 103 fever.
Did you go to the doctor or anything?
No, because I had been.
It was warm today, but it's been a little bit better, yeah. Hey, Rob, is Zoom on? Hey, for those of you on Zoom, welcome. We'll start in about 1 minute. Okay, for those of you on Zoom, welcome. Glad you're here. Also for all of you here in the seats. Yeah. If you're on Zoom and you got a question or comment, please just type it in the chat. Rob will relay it. And then, of course, here, Helen will bring you the mic if you have a question or a comment as well. So just shoot your hand up or speak up, and we'll do that. Well, tonight's our last night of this class going through the book of Genesis. And as you can see from the screen here, we'll talk about Jacob and his children, his wives Leah and Rachel, and then his sons and daughters as well. That includes Joseph, who kind of takes up the bulk of the last about 25% of the book of Genesis, his story. So I want to read through just the end of what we were talking about last week when Jacob, remember that he deceives or tricks his twin brother Esau out of the blessing from Isaac after already kind of using a little deception, but really just a good legal challenge to Esau to get his birthright. So the birthright, remember, is like that double portion of the inheritance that's supposed to go to the firstborn son. The blessing that Jacob gets from his father Isaac is the blessing that is the promise from God to Abraham, to Isaac, and now going to Jacob. And that, of course, was with the help of his mother Rebekah, Isaac's wife Rebekah, who God had told that the promise is and blessing are supposed to go to Jacob, not to Esau. And she helps make that happen. So it says, this is in chapter 27, verse 34, when Esau heard his father's words, he burst out with a loud and bitter cry and said to his father, "Bless me too, father." But he said, "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? This is the second time he has taken advantage of me. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing." So remember Jacob itself, that when it says Jacob and Esau as twins were born, that Jacob came out grasping at the heel of Esau, who was the firstborn, and Jacob was grasping at his heel. That phrase in Hebrew is akin to saying trickster, deceiver, liar. So here Esau is saying, isn't he rightly named Jacob? Isn't he rightly named liar because he lies? Isn't he rightly named trickster because he tricks? Isn't he rightly named deceiver because he deceives and has deceived me? So he says, that guy fits his name. Isaac answered Esau, "I have made him lord over you and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you, my son?" Esau said to his father, "Do you only have one blessing? Bless me too." So Isaac does bless him. "Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck." So not the best blessing ever, but still gives him a blessing. So Esau, not surprisingly, held a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing his father had given him. He said to himself, "The days of mourning for my father are near." In other words, Jacob, his father, is probably soon to die. Little did he know Isaac will live for another 20 years, but remember we talked about last week, Isaac was kind of perpetually on his deathbed throughout his life. So he thinks the days of my, mourning my father are near, then I will kill my brother Jacob. So Rebekah, their mother, hears this, fears for Jacob's life, says, "You got to go away, go up to the region of Paddan Aram." Paddan Aram was the region where Abraham first came, when he left his homeland of Ur and came up kind of to the top of the Fertile Crescent. That's where God gave Abraham the call, is saying, go forth to the land I will show you, and leads him down there. It's also the area where Abraham's brother stayed. So when Abraham sends his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, he sends him up to Paddan Aram to his brother's house and gets Rebekah as Isaac's wife. So now Rebekah, who doesn't like the women that Esau has married, says, "You need to go up to Paddan Aram and marry somebody from our family. Go see my brother Laban up in Paddan Aram and stay there away from your brother who is trying to kill you." On his way, this is in chapter 28, Jacob stops at Bethel. Bethel was a place that Abraham stopped when he came into the promised land. It's the place that Jacob will stop when he comes back to the promised land. And it's the place that Joshua, when he leads the Israelites into the promised land, also stops. So there's consistency for the author here on this stop at this place called Bethel to offer praise to God, to seek God's guidance. And he has this dream there. You may have heard the phrase Jacob's ladder. That's this dream. It's kind of, I guess, more like a stairway or something like that, like in this picture. But so it's kind of a stairway, ladder. We don't know exactly. But so he has this dream. Basically, the dream is communicating to Jacob, you are not ready for the blessing yet. You got it from Isaac, but you deceived your brother. You're not the kind of person you need to be to carry on this promise and blessing. But God reiterates the promise to him, saying, you will come back to this land. And so he reiterates the promise to Jacob that he is still guiding him, watching over him, and will bring him back to the promised land to continue the blessing and promise through him. So he makes it up to Paddan-aram and finds there his mother's brother, so his uncle Laban, and then he finds his cousins, Laban's two daughters, Rachel and Leah. He sees Rachel and kind of falls in love with her. And it says, this is in chapter 29, starting in verse 14. After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. So Laban had two daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel had a lovely figure and was beautiful. It's kind of an odd verse in our English there, like, oh, Leah was nearsighted, or Leah was, like, she had weak eyes. It's kind of an odd phrase. The phrase there actually kind of just means soft, delicate, sensitive, tender eyes. So it actually, oftentimes you'll see this contrasting view that Rachel was beautiful and Leah was ugly, but that really is not what the verse there is saying, and not what we should take from it. If anything, it says that Leah's eyes were actually really beautiful. It was her best feature. So it's kind of a comparison saying Rachel seems to be all around lovely, and Leah had beautiful eyes. But it could also mean that she was actually the more kind of tender-hearted, sensitive one. That, like we talk about eyes being the view to somebody's soul. When it says she has weak eyes, really it's sensitive, soft, tender, considerate. So it could be really actually be talking about the kind of person that Leah is, not that she needs glasses or something like that. Verse 18, Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel. So Laban says, hey, you've been hanging out here, you've been working. Yeah, I know you don't expect to work for free forever, so what do you want? And he says, I want to marry your younger daughter, Rachel. And he says, okay, work for 7 years, and then you can marry her. So he must really love her. He agrees to this. So Laban said, it's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me. Verse 20, so Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. That's sweet. Then Jacob said to Laban, give me my wife. That's a little more harsh, but okay, he deserves 7 years. My time is completed, and I want to make love to her. So Laban brought together all the people of the place and gave a feast. But when evening came, he took his daughter Leah and brought her to Jacob, and Jacob made love to her. And Laban gave his servant Zilpah to his daughter as her attendant. And this is the funniest verse to me. When morning came, there was Leah. So the verse communicates probably how surprising it is to Jacob here. In the morning, oh wait, you're Leah, you're not Rachel. In the morning, there was Leah. So Jacob said to Laban, what is this you've done to me? I served you for 7 years for Rachel. Why have you deceived me? Which is kind of a funny thing coming from Jacob. Laban replied, well, it's not our custom here to have the younger daughter in marriage, to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Finish this daughter's bridal week, then we will give you the younger one also in return for another 7 years of work. So he doesn't have to wait another 7 years. He has to wait 7 days till the bridal week's done. Then he gets to marry Rachel, but he has to stay for a total of 14 years, another 7 years in order to have the right to marry Rachel now. So it's for the author of Genesis, this is hilarious. It's like the trickster has been tricked, the deceiver has been deceived, the liar has been lied to, and in a similar way, it was through essentially darkness, blindness, that he tricked his father Isaac. And now it's through darkness, this kind of blindness, that he has been tricked by Laban into this. And it's also ironic for the author of Genesis. Another reason the author would probably think it's hilarious is that he has to acknowledge the rights of the firstborn. Remember that Jacob tricked his brother Esau out of the right of the firstborn. He said, sell me your birthright and I'll give you the red stuff. I'll give you the red stew. And Esau agrees to this. So he took the right of the firstborn, and now here he's being forced to acknowledge the right of the firstborn daughter. Laban says, oh, well, and you can imagine Laban is like, oh, I thought you knew all along. This is how it worked. Of course, he didn't really think Jacob was expecting Leah, but he says, oh, well, yeah, we don't do that here in this land. And you imagine Jacob like, couldn't you mention this in the last 7 years sometime? But he did not. So he stays another 7 years here to have won the right to marry Rachel. Gets a little, taste of his own medicine from his old uncle Laban there. And it says in verse 28, Jacob did it. He stayed another 7 years. He finished the week with Leah. Then Laban gave him his daughter Rachel to be his wife. Laban gave his servant Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as her attendant. Jacob made love to Rachel also, and his love for Rachel was greater than his love for Leah. And he worked for Laban another 7 years. So here's kind of the bartering. Here's a little meme, so Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah. Here's another kind of picture that is, yeah. So already I think you feel a little bit for Leah. We have no idea what Leah thought about all this. She was just, who knows, at the last minute, or maybe she was part of the plan. We don't really know that her father just says, you're going to go in there and you're going to be married to him. And then, so you can imagine Leah, if you're Leah thinking, well, this, I'm not sure about this, but okay, I'll go do this. And then your dad turns right around and says, well, you get to marry her sister too. You get both of them. And Leah, who knows all along that Jacob loves Rachel, the kind of place that she's in, or the marriage that she's in from the very start here. In verse 31, it says, when the Lord saw that Leah was not loved, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. Leah became pregnant and gave birth to a son. So she has a son. It's Jacob's firstborn son. His name is Reuben. Then she gives birth to another son whose name is Simeon, a third son whose name is Levi, and then a fourth son whose name is Judah. And then it says, at that point, she stops having children. Chapter 30, when Rachel saw that she was not bearing any children, she became jealous of her sister. She said to Jacob, give me children or I'll die. Jacob became angry with her and said, am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children? Then she said, here is Bilhah, my servant. Sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her. Where have we seen this before? You obviously we're meant to recognize the similarity here between this story and the one with Sarah giving Hagar to Abraham. So this is Rachel's servant. I'll put this up in case you're trying to follow along here. I don't know if this will help you or not, but little bit of a family tree here. We're kind of right in the middle. Laban with his two daughters, Leah and Rachel, they're married to Jacob, and right beneath them it has the name of their handmaiden, their servant that their father gave to them as part of this. So this is, firstly, Leah has 4 sons. Rachel still has none. So she gives her servant to Jacob, Bilhah, and says, sleep with her. She has 2 sons named Dan and Naphtali. Leah says, hey, that's a good idea, and gives her servant Zilpah to Jacob and says, have more children with her. She has 2 sons named Gad and Asher. So that's so far 8 of Jacob's 12 sons that he'll eventually have here. It does. It says in verse 17, God listened to Leah, and she became pregnant and bore Jacob a fifth son. So his name is Issachar. Leah conceived again, bears Jacob a sixth son named Zebulun. And it's funny the way they describe this. Leah said, God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband, so she named him Issachar. God, this time my husband will treat me with honor because I have borne him six sons. So she named him Zebulun. Each of the six sons that she has and the four sons that the servants have, they got some great rhyme or reason to what their name is. And then look at verse 21. Sometime later she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. Like not much fanfare for Dinah there, and perhaps we'll see why in a minute. But verse 22, God remembered Rachel. Remember when we talk about that word remember, like God remembered Noah, God remembers Abraham. It's not just like, oh yeah, that guy, like kind of remembers. It's remembers with a purpose. Like God is paying attention to this person. So God remembers Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. So now finally Rachel has had a son. And if we know anything from our author of Genesis with these women who were barren and then have a child, we kind of know from the start there's probably going to be something special about Joseph. So chapter 21, Jacob at this point has become very rich. He's worked for Laban for almost 20 years at this point. He is very wealthy. And then it says chapter 31, Jacob heard that Laban's sons, his wife's brothers, were saying, Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude toward him was not what it had been. So Jacob is starting to recognize, okay, the situation has changed. This isn't where we need to be anymore. So then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the fields where his flocks were. He said to them, and this is a picture up here of this kind of meeting, Jacob talking to Rachel and Leah. They've got some of the children with them. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude toward me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know that I have worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me by changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. Down in verse 14 it says, Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. It's interesting that in this, and actually in the Hebrew, it uses a singular verb there, meaning Rachel and Leah are speaking as one, which is unique for all the animosity that has been occurring between the two of them. Unlike Hagar and Sarah, where the animosity was between Sarah and her servant Hagar, they don't seem to have any issue with their servants Bilhah and Zilpah here. It's between the two sisters. But in this instance, they speak as one. They say, we agree with you. Our father, is not doing what he should. We're supposed to have inheritance rights, and we don't. So they're like, we're with you. Let's get out of here. Let's go back to the land that you were promised, and your father and his father were promised. Are there any questions or comments so far? I know that's a lot to go through real quick. So, when Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban, the Aramean, by not telling him he was running away. So until this point, Jacob has been the central character. He's the main actor. He's the one doing everything. Everyone else is kind of being acted upon. It changes here when it says, Rachel stole her father's household gods. We don't know exactly what those are. They seem to be some sort of, like, there's something physical, like a little idol, a little trinket. I can't ever help but think of those little troll dolls, like people who play bingo, bring and put in front of them for good luck, whatever. That's what I always think when I think of this type of thing. But it's something physical that she takes from her father's household. And then it even says that it uses similar language, that Rachel stole the household god and Jacob stole the mind or heart, is kind of what the Hebrew says, of Laban. So in this instance, it's Rachel doing the acting and Jacob is following her lead, essentially. We don't really know why she takes these. We don't know if she actually thought that these household gods that belonged to her father had some sort of magical powers, like they were going to help Laban track them down. Remember, they're getting out of there. Their father Laban is off shearing sheep, and they're like, now's the time. Let's get out of here. Our father has changed. Our brothers don't want us here. We're gone. So what they worry about, of course, is being tracked down by Laban and Rachel and Leah's brothers. So it's possible that Rachel thinks that these household gods, these idols or trinkets, are going to actually help them track them down, and so she takes them. It's also possible that she thought that the idols, these household gods, actually signified family leadership. So from Rachel's perspective, it's like, Jacob should be the leader of this family. My husband Jacob should be the leader of this family, so these are mine now. I'm taking these to show that Jacob is the leader of the family now. He's the patriarch. And it's also possible she thinks that her son Joseph should be the rightful heir of the blessing and the promise. So by taking those, she's also kind of claiming that right for her son Joseph. Remember, at this point, it's her only son, her only child. It's also possible that Rachel that even though she was upset with her father, still felt some semblance of compassion for him and just took him so that he couldn't use them anymore. That essentially she took him so that he would no longer worship idols. That after all this time, she thinks it's about time he worshiped Yahweh, the one true God, the God of my husband and his father before him, who is part of the same family as Abraham, that of course she is and her father is. So it's possible she just thinks, I'm going to spare him from keeping up this life of sin with these idols. So we don't exactly know why she takes them, but she takes them. And Laban's not happy about that. And Laban catches up to him. In verse 26, it says, when he catches up to him, he says to Jacob, "What have you done? You've deceived me. You've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps?" And he might be overselling it. Like, maybe he really wanted to do that, but it sounds like he might be overselling it. "You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing." And then he says, "And besides all of that, why did you steal my gods?" So they leave. This is Jacob and his wives and their servants and children at this point. Leah's got 6 sons, and one of them is holding little Dinah, the daughter. Then, of course, the 2 servants over on the right with 2 sons each, and Rachel, of course, under the arm of Jacob with Joseph in her arms. So this is where, a painting of where Laban catches up to them and is saying this to Jacob, is saying, why did you leave so quickly? You didn't give me a chance to say goodbye. I would have thrown you a party to send you off. And besides all that, why in the world did you steal my idols? Why did you take my household gods? Jacob answered Laban, verse 31, "I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who has your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me. And if so, take it." Now, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the gods. So automatically, for the author of Genesis, this is setting up a drama, a dramatic point in the story. Because what has he done? He didn't know that Rachel took the gods. So in this big show to Laban, he says, if you find anyone who did, they'll surely die. They will not live. And kind of almost inadvertently puts a curse on Rachel. So Laban goes into Jacob's tent and into Leah's tent and into the tent of the 2 female servants, finds nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. So in this painting, that's kind of what you can see here. What she's sitting on is essentially the camel saddle with the household gods inside of it. So underneath her there. Laban searched through everything in the tent but found nothing. Rachel said to her father, "Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. I'm having my period." So he searched but could not find the household gods. Now, in the NIV in the English, it transferred as like, I'm menstruating, I'm having my period, whatever it is. But what it actually says in the Hebrew is, I'm having the way of women. Now, this is a play on words for the author of Genesis, because what is the way of women to the author of Genesis but trickery and deception? We've seen it with Lot's daughters. We've seen it with Rebekah. We're going to see it we see it with Rachel, and we see it with two other women that are coming up in our story. And in all instances except one, with Potiphar's wife, there is no judgment about what they did. The trickery almost seems like to be a good thing. So for the author of Genesis, the way of women is, for one, she says, sorry, I can't rise up against you or stand up to greet you. I'm having the way of women. Well, partly what that means is I have no legal recourse against you. I'm a woman, so I can't stand up to you like in a court setting, is what she's saying. And you can tell, again, that she feels cheated by her father in this, by saying this. But, again, for the author of Genesis, the play on words there is, I'm having the way of women, which is, I'm tricking you, basically, is what she's saying without saying it. And once again, for the author of Genesis, this is not seen as sinful or a bad thing or anything like that. So he searches, but he can't find the household gods. So early the next morning, verse 55, Laban kisses his grandchildren and his daughters and blesses them. He left, he returns home. Jacob and he make this new covenant, this new agreement. They have an understanding. Shows some sort of growth here, because for 20 years, we didn't get into all the stories of back and forth with Jacob and Laban, but basically for 20 years, they kept lying to each other. You know, there's weird stuff about Jacob doing something with these sheep and goats and plants to make them have stripes, and then getting the good ones, and Laban's tricking them, and even said, he's changed my wages 10 times. Like, there's been bad back and forth between Jacob and Laban for 20 years, and now finally they have come to agreement. Jacob's going to continue back to the land promised to him and his family by God, and Laban is going back to Paddan-aram. So Jacob, you know, again, this is showing some sort of growth. I mean, who he was as a young man, this trickster and deceiver, has now become a man who can respect another, you know, do something just, do something fair in making this agreement with Laban. So now Jacob's problem is he's going back to the land where his brother is. So he knows what he's going to come up against when he encounters Esau in his mind. So chapter 32, verse 3 says, Jacob sent messengers ahead of him to his brother Esau in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. And he instructed them, this is what you are to say to Esau. Your servant Jacob, automatically there is kind of a red flag for the author of Genesis. Because remember, the whole blessing to Jacob and the semi-blessing from Isaac to Esau was that Esau would serve Jacob. That was what God had told Rebekah. That's what Isaac tells Jacob, and that's what Isaac tells Esau. But right away, Jacob says, tell them your servant Jacob. So obviously, again, we see some sort of growth in humility here. Remember the dream that Jacob had at Bethel, Jacob's ladder, Jacob's stairway, whatever it is, basically telling him, you're not ready to be the person of the promise yet, but I'm going to bring you back to this land. Right now we see what God has been doing with Jacob for these 20 years and is making him the person he should be as he brings him back to this land. So a little humility here from Jacob. And it says, when the messengers came back to Jacob, they said, we went to your brother Esau, and he's coming out to meet you with 400 fighting men with him. So Jacob's like, okay, this isn't going how I was hoping it was going to go. I said your servant. I'm showing humility, bro. But he's worried. So this is where we encounter the story that we talked about the first week. Jacob gets to the river Jabbok. He sends all the family across and on ahead. And then he has this strange encounter with a messenger from God, with an angel, with God himself. There's all kinds of ways to see it. But essentially, even if it's a messenger or an angel, the picture is that they're there representing God And so Jacob, that's why you often hear it said Jacob wrestled with God. And even at the end, when this messenger, this person could not overpower Jacob, he says, from now on, you're not going to be known as Jacob anymore. So this is, again, part of the transition God has brought Jacob through in order to bring him back to the promised land to be the person of the promise. That he says, look, you're not going to be the liar, the trickster, and the deceiver anymore. That's in your past. Leave it behind. From now on, you're going to be known as Israel, which, again, means like struggles with God, struggled with God. I told you before that one person translated as the God fighter. All those kind of things, that you struggled. And this is a picture that Israelites, all the way down to today with modern Israelis, take this to heart. They love the picture of that they are the people of the struggle. They struggle with God. They wrestle with Scripture. In Israel, there's a little, haven't you seen, like in our grocery stores, you see the hummus called Sabra, S-A-B-R-A, if you've ever had that or seen it. Sabra is actually a little fruit. It's like a little cactus with like horns kind of, or thorns kind of on the outside of it. And Israelis love to think of themselves as sabra, these kind of fruit, because they're very terse and prickly and everything on the outside, but they're extremely sweet and tender inside. So modern Israelis love that picture of themselves. They love that it comes all the way from Jacob as the God fighter. We are a people who have struggled for thousands of years with those around us, with God himself, and we have persevered and come through it. So again, Jacob, wrestles here. Then he moves on. Chapter 33, Jacob, he crosses Jabbok the next day. He looks up, and there was Esau coming with his 400 fighting men. So he divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the 2 female servants. He put the female servants and their children in front. So maybe Jacob needs to grow up a little more, but he puts the 2 servants and their sons up front. You can imagine why. Leah and her children next, and then Rachel and Joseph back here in the rear, protecting them the most. He himself, at least, went on ahead and bowed down to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother. But Esau ran to meet Jacob and embraced him. He threw his arms around his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So here's a little cartoon there. I thought you wanted to kill me. I did. But so again, 20 years later now, God is bringing Jacob back to this land of the promise to be the person of the promise. Again, we see that he still has a little growing up to do, but even at his age. But at this point, at least, he has been reconciled with his brother. And that's certainly one of the signs to him from God that he is becoming the person that he's supposed to be. So verse 18, after Jacob came from Paddan Aram, he arrived safely at the city of Shechem in Canaan and camped within sight of the city. For 100 pieces of silver, he bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, the plot of ground where he pitched his tent. The reason I mention that is because of the next story. But are there any questions or comments about any of that? All right. So, yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The question was, why would Esau bring the 400 fighting men if he didn't intend to fight? We don't really know. It could be that he just wanted to get one little last kind of, I made you worry kind of out of Jacob for all that he had put him through. Like, hey, I'm coming up with all these guys, but I'm going to hug and kiss you. All is forgiven, but wanted that one last little, like, I'm going to make him worry to the end. Maybe he thought Jacob was going to come at him like, hey, Jacob thinks I want to kill him, which I did, and he's now coming back to this land. Maybe he's coming prepared for a fight and is not going to let me come embrace him before we have the chance to throw down, basically. So maybe they're just protection. Maybe it's one last little dig kind of at his brother to make him worry before he forgives him and they reconcile. But yeah, it's a good question. We don't know. We don't know why he would do that necessarily. Any other question or comment? Yeah, Bob.
I came a little late, so you may have covered this, but going back to these are the
Mm-hmm.
polygamy and basically the use of concubines, for lack of a better term. And I guess, like you always say, the author of Genesis is pretty neutral on that. I mean, God did establish monogamy, didn't he? I think he did. You know, a man should leave his father and mother and go to his wife, and the two will be one, not 3, 4, or 5.
Yeah, Bob's question was really about just this is the beginning of the nation of Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob are the 12 tribes of Israel. Everybody is descended from one of the sons. So the 12 sons of Jacob are the 12 tribes of Israel, or become the 12 tribes of Israel. And Bob was mentioning that all this is coming about with the use of marrying multiple women, having multiple wives, having concubines, having children with these servants. And again, yeah, we would want some sort of like disclaimer, I think, from our perspective, like, well, God established monogamy with Adam and Eve, and that's where it's supposed to be. You know, Paul tells us that in the New Testament, and, you know, this isn't, I don't condone this behavior, but, you know, this is what happened. But for the author of Genesis, he's very unconcerned with that. Again, we don't get any kind of theology and doctrine and this is good, this is bad kind of from the author of Genesis. It's just very plain. Like he said, I mean, you can tell from our 6 weeks of stories, they're anything but just simple and plain, but he's plain in his understanding or his portrayal of these are the people. These are the people God is using. These are the people God is turning from nobodies into somebodies for his own purposes. And you can see that they're people that not only do we not like them a lot of times, but we would outright just not want them to be, you know, we won't want to be friends with them. Some of you who have been to Israel with me or have been in like a Wednesday night class I taught or anything know this story. But when I was in college, I went the first day of class it was one of those once a week 3-hour classes. And it was on Acts, and we show up, and the professor has up on the screen this huge family tree. I mean, hundreds of names on this family tree. And about a third of them were highlighted in green. And so he's got that up, you know, everybody's filtering into class. He starts class. He's going over the syllabus. He's going over that. It gets to break an hour and a half in. We come back from break. He's, you know, going through more, doing an introduction to the class. 3 hours go by. He never says one word about the family tree till the very end. And remember, this class is on the book of Acts, and he finally tells us, because he's Australian, that this is his family tree, and the third of the names highlighted in green were all convicts and prisoners. So his point to us was, there are lots of people in our family tree sometimes that we would rather leave out of it. We'd rather not mention them or say that they're part of our history or our family tree. And it's the same way in our church, in our Christian family. Obviously, as an introduction to the book of Acts, he's saying, this is where the church started. When you start talking about stuff in the Crusades and the Inquisition and all kinds of things throughout 2,000 years of Christian church history, there's a lot of people we'd want to leave out of that family tree. But his point was, they're still part of it. They still can be used by God. People can be redeemed by God. And so certainly, I think when we look at Genesis, when we look at a lot of these people, we don't like them sometimes, or we really are upset sometimes by the stuff that they do to their own family members, to the people they're supposed to be watching out for, looking out for. And for the author of Genesis, that's part of his point, is Abraham was a nobody. God told him to go somewhere, and he did. He obeyed, so God counted that as righteousness to him and gave him this promise. And God, because he's God and gave a promise and covenant, keeps it even when people like Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Jacob are deceptive, when they don't act in moral ways, ethical ways, that author of Genesis is like, here's the people. Here's the people God chose. Here's the people God redeems. And here's the people who are the people of the promise, even when we don't think they deserve to be. Any other question or comment? So now the story of, we finally get back to Jacob's daughter Dinah. We find out later he has other daughters, but we're only told of one specifically, and only one we're told of her name here. So chapter 34, Dinah, the daughter Leah had born to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. Remember, they're in Shechem. Her father Jacob has just bought this whole land from Hamor and his son Shechem. So verse 2, when Shechem, son of Hamor, the ruler of that area, saw her, he took her and raped her. His heart was drawn to Dinah, daughter of Jacob. He loved the young woman and spoke tenderly to her. Seems a little later, not the right order of those things. And Shechem said to his father Hamor, "Get me this girl as my wife." When Jacob heard that his daughter Dinah had been defiled, his sons were in the fields with his livestock, so he did nothing about it until they came home. Remember how I was just saying sometimes we don't like these people? Jacob hears that this has happened to his daughter Dinah, and he's like, I'll wait till my boys get home and see what they want to do about it. Then Shechem's father Hamor went out to talk with Jacob. So Jacob does nothing, but the father of the man who raped his daughter seeks him out. He's active. Jacob does nothing. This man seeks him out. He comes to talk with Jacob. Meanwhile, Jacob's sons had come in from the fields at this point, and as soon as they heard what happened, they were shocked and furious because Shechem had done an outrageous thing in Israel by sleeping with Jacob's daughter, a thing that should not be done. But Hamor, this is Shechem, the man who raped Dinah, but Hamor, the ruler of the area, said to them, "My son Shechem has his heart set on your daughter. Please give her to him as his wife, intermarry with us, give us your daughters, and take our daughters for yourselves. You can settle among us, the land is open to you, live in it, trade in it, and acquire property in it." So, a nice gesture from the ruler of this area, certainly, but for what his son did to Dinah, I don't know that we could say is equal, but it's certainly a gesture from this man to Jacob and his family. Verse 11, Jacob said to Dinah's father and brothers, "Let me find favor in your eyes, and I will give you whatever you ask. Make the price for your bride and the gift I am to bring as great as you like, and I'll pay whatever you ask me. Only give me the young woman as my wife." Because their sister Dinah had been defiled, Jacob's sons replied deceitfully as they spoke to Shechem and his father Hamor. They said to them, "Well, we can't do such a thing. We can't give our sister to a man who is not circumcised." Now, Shechem at this point is probably, I don't like where this is going, but I said you can ask for anything no matter how great a price. And okay, that would be a disgrace to us. We will enter an agreement with you on one condition. You and everyone else get circumcised, and then we'll intermarry. You can marry our sister. And then verse 18, their proposal seemed good to Hamor and his son Shechem. I don't know if they thought it was good, but they probably thought it was fair at least. The young man, who was the most honored of all his father's family, lost no time in doing what they said because he was delighted with Jacob's daughter. These men were, so Hamor and his son went to the gate of their city to speak to the men of the city. This is probably a hard sell. And they're like, okay, we think this is a fair trade. Now we got to go convince all the rest of the men of our city. So they say, this is what we need to do. All the men, verse 24, all the men who went out of the city agreed with Hamor and his son Shechem. Every male in the city was circumcised. 3 days later, while all of them were still in pain, two of Jacob's sons, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took their swords and attacked the unsuspecting city, killing every male. They put Hamor and his son Shechem to the sword and took Dinah from Shechem's house and left. The sons of Jacob came upon the dead bodies and looted the city where their sister had been defiled. They seized their flocks and herds and donkeys and everything else of theirs in the city and out in the fields. They carried off all their wealth and all their women and children, taking as plunder everything in the houses. Then Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, "You have brought trouble on me by making me obnoxious to the Canaanites and Perizzites, the people living in this land. We are few in number, and if they join forces against me and attack me, I and my household will be destroyed." But they replied, "Should he have treated our sister like a prostitute?" So Jacob, who again did nothing at first, still had done nothing. It's the brothers who say, hey, this is a good idea. We'll all intermarry. We'll all get along here. We'll all share and trade and prosper. All you got to do is every man in your city needs to be circumcised. Hamor and Shechem say, okay, we'll do that. And of course, while they're debilitated, they come in, they execute them, they plunder the city, they take everything. And what does Jacob say? But how could you do this to me? Now we're not going to be at peace with these people. I was all set to have lots of riches here, and you now have wrecked that opportunity. And what's going to happen if they all get together and come back and attack us? They've got a lot of people. We don't have that many. They're going to come get us. And then this reply, but they replied, should he have treated our sister like a prostitute? Now, we always read that, or I think traditionally we read that as the sons are replying, Simeon and Levi are replying to Jacob about Hamor and Shechem, saying to their dad, well, should we have allowed them to treat our sister like a prostitute? But the author of Genesis purposefully leaves this vague. What they could be doing is saying to each other about Jacob, should we have let our father Jacob treat our sister like a prostitute? In other words, well, what are we supposed to do? Dad did nothing. He just sat by while our sister was defiled. Remember that Dinah, Simeon, and Levi are all the children of Leah. So it's, again, there's probably some sense from Simeon and Levi that they are not the favored children. And so saying, our dad just sat by and did nothing, like he wasn't ever going to do anything for our sister Dinah. It was up to us. And saying to each other, should we have just let our father treat our sister like a prostitute? In other words, our dad was just going to basically sell her dignity away to these people for the riches that they were offering. Any questions or comments about Dinah? What's that? Oh, what's her happy ending? Yeah, we don't ever get a happy ending for her from the author of Genesis. The question, of course, was, where's Dinah's happy ending here? Yeah, we don't get that. We don't get that for really a lot of Leah's children. Other than the fact, of course, that 6 of her sons become, the ancestors of, 6 of the 12 tribes of Israel. But we see at the end of Genesis, when Jacob goes to bless his sons, that for the most part, the sons of Leah don't particularly get great blessings. Kind of like Esau. Any other question or comment? Yeah, Bob?
Dysfunctional.
Yeah.
It's basically dysfunctional. I mean, when you have more than one wife, you have divided loyalties, and we'll see it, definitely with Joseph and what the brothers do to him, so there is, I think, consequence that kind of speaks to that this isn't an ideal situation.
Yeah, and interestingly, from the author of Genesis, he does seem to offer more judgment on the brothers who plundered the city than even Simeon and Levi for executing the men of the city. Almost like Simeon and Levi were trying to do something that was kind of retribution or justice for their sister, whereas the brothers plundering the city were just out for themselves. So yeah, and you mentioned the dysfunctional part. I mentioned to you before, I think, in the first week that I have a friend who's a pastor up in the Bay Area and is doing a series on Genesis, and the subtitle of his series on Genesis is Family is Complicated. So that's probably an understatement. I think your dysfunctional definition probably fits them more. Yeah.
Judah was son of Leah, right?
Judah, yes.
But did Jesus come from the son of, or from the line of Judah?
Yes.
Yeah, so there's something good that came out of the sons of Leah. Jesus.
Absolutely. Spoiler alert for everybody who didn't know that so far. But that is absolutely correct. So that's why I said most of her sons don't get particularly good blessings at the end, but the best blessing will be for Judah. So chapter 35, God says to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there, and build an altar there to God who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you, and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go up to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. Now, what does the author of Genesis not tell us that you might be thinking of? They gave him all the foreign gods they had in their possession to be buried here at Bethel. Who had foreign gods with them? Rachel. The author of Genesis doesn't specifically point this out, but the picture that's happening here is at some point, Jacob realizes that Rachel stole these gods from her father. Now, in his mind, what's now happening? Oh no, I said whoever would be found with those idols would surely die. Then they moved on from Bethel. While they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel began to give birth and had great difficulty. And as she was having great difficulty in childbirth, the midwife said to her, "Don't despair, for you have another son." As she breathed her last, for she was dying, she named her son Ben-Oni, but his father named him Benjamin. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Over her tomb, Jacob set up a pillar, and to this day that pillar marks Rachel's tomb. Israel moved on again and pitched his tent beyond Migdal-Eder. While Israel was living in that region, Reuben went in and slept with his father's concubine Bilhah, and Israel heard of it. So right there, you can probably see the author is going to start using the names Jacob and Israel interchangeably. He kind of goes back and forth between those two names, kind of as a constant reminder of, remember this is Jacob, remember the kind of person he was, but also remember who God is creating him to be, who God is turning him into. Not just him as the person Israel, but his sons becoming the nation of Israel. So sometimes it gets a little confusing that he goes back and forth with the names there. But we do have this weird verse here that Reuben, the firstborn son, goes in and sleeps with the servant of Rachel. So the picture is that Reuben is kind of is trying to essentially take control of the family. He's asserting his position in the family by sleeping with the servant of his father's favorite wife, which was Rachel. So that's what is happening here with Reuben there. Here's a picture of Rachel as she dies, with Benjamin being held behind her by one of the midwives. Again, this is on the way to Bethlehem. There's still a place near Bethlehem today that's called Rachel's tomb. That marks the place of this instance. So again, this family tree. So now we have Benjamin added to the family tree over there on the far bottom right as a son of Rachel. So now the 12 sons that become the 12 tribes have all been born at this point. And so it says these were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan-aram. Jacob came home to his father Isaac near Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had stayed. Isaac lived 180 years. And at this point, you're probably, the author or the reader is probably, wait, that guy's still alive? Isaac's still breathing? Well, finally not anymore here in our story. He lived 180 years, he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, old and full of years, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So again, Esau and Jacob come back together to bury their father Isaac, just as Isaac and Ishmael had come together to bury their father Abraham. So we're going to get into the last part of our story here, which is the story of Joseph. His coat there is not quite Technicolor dream coat status, but you can tell it's a kind of a coat of many colors there in this picture. Are there any questions or comments before we get into Joseph's story? Why did he what?
So his favorite wife had one more kid, and she was dying, and she named him, and he's all, no, I'm going to call him Benjamin instead. Why would he change the name?
Yeah, she calls him something like son of strength, and he changes it to Benjamin, son of my right hand, which is partly why we get the picture or the comment from the author about Reuben trying to kind of take control of the family, because it's essentially like Reuben saying, you're calling this son Benjamin, son of my right hand, but really I should be Benjamin, son of your right hand, because I'm the firstborn, and kind of usurps that place. But we don't know exactly why Jacob changed the name. In all these instances, all the previous 11 sons, the women name the children. They say, I'm going to call him this because of this. And Rachel does the same thing here. I'm going to call him Ben-Ami. Then she dies. And he's like, nah, Benjamin's better. So we don't exactly know why in this one instance that Jacob decides to go a different way with the name versus his previous 11 sons and the women that birthed them giving them the names. But yeah, that is the picture we get of Reuben, though, trying to say, I should be the son of your right hand. So we're going to read certain parts of Joseph's story, but I'm going to give you more of an overview through it. Yeah, Wendy, yeah?
I was just, Bob and I were just thinking, we kind of thought of it at the same time, that reminded us what Reuben did with the handmaiden was the same thing that David's son Absalom did when he wanted to usurp David and slept with his concubine.
Yeah.
And kind of was, David had to run and flee and hide and so forth.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We get the same picture later with David and Absalom, where Absalom sleeps with his father David's concubines to basically usurp the throne, and so to speak, and claim it for himself. So certainly Reuben is doing something similar here to that. Any other question or comment? What's that? X-rated, yeah. I think the first way I said, a lot of these stories are not flannel board material. They're not meant for Sunday school with the children on Sunday mornings. And we're going to get another story like that here in a minute, but stay tuned. But first we have Joseph. Joseph, not surprisingly, is a favorite of Jacob. He is the son of his beloved Rachel. He favors Joseph. Joseph, I always loved, if you were around when Jim Price would preach on the story of Joseph, I always loved him talking about the story of Joseph and talking about how much of a brat Joseph was. At this point, he's like 17 years old. The two pictures here is one, Jacob, his father, giving him this special coat. Of course, the Broadway show was Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. We call it Coat of Many Colors. But whatever it was obviously a special coat. It was probably expensive because of all the coloring. Obviously something that the brothers are not going to be particularly thrilled that Joseph gets and none of them received. The other picture there is of one of the dreams that Joseph has been having. These haystacks that represent his brothers all bowing down before him. And the problem with Joseph is he starts telling everybody about these dreams. He first tells his father Jacob, and Jacob's like, I kind of agree with you, but let's keep it under wraps. Like, let's not go sharing all this. And of course, Joseph goes out and starts sharing it, tells his brothers, hey, guess what? I had a dream that all the stars in the sky and the moon and everything else was bowing down to me. I had this dream that all these haystacks were bowing down to me. And the brothers are no dummies. They catch on that basically Joseph is saying, hey, you're all going to serve me. And remember, Joseph at this point is 17. Certainly his oldest brother, Reuben, is much older than he is at this point. So this punk teenager brother of theirs coming along and saying these things would obviously be upsetting. So they're in the region of Shechem, the same place that their sister Dinah had been defiled. They're in this region. They're out in the fields, and they start coming up with this plan with Joseph. And if you're familiar with the story, their first plan is, hey, let's throw them in a ditch and be done with it. We'll just throw them in this cistern, this well, this ditch. We don't know exactly what it was that they were talking about, but essentially they throw him in there and he would eventually die. Reuben, for his part, this is one of the areas we see a little bit of a changing character for one of the sons. Reuben, in this case, he says, hey, it was kind of his idea. Let's put him in here because he thought, once all my brothers leave, I'll come get Joseph out. So we do see, it's kind of this funny change that he goes in, sleeps with Rachel's servant to kind of take command of the family, but then he's looking out for his brother here. He's not ready to kill him or have him die. But so they say, yeah, let's leave him here. So we don't really know where Reuben goes at this point. He goes off, probably hoping that they would leave and he could come back and get Joseph out of there. But then Judah comes up with a better idea. He says, hey, why should we just leave this kid in here to die? If we sell him to these people passing by on the road over here, we'll get some money for him. And then he's really gone. Nobody's going to find him here and, tell our dad about it. Like, he'll be gone. We'll have money. this is a much better plan. So they do that, and Judah comes up with a second part of the plan, which is we're going to take, this goat, and we'll slaughter it. We'll tear Jacob's coat, his clothes. We'll put the blood of the goat on it, take it to our father, and show it to him. So this is in chapter 37, verse 31. They got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, "We found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." And of course, Jacob recognizes it and becomes completely distraught about what has happened to his beloved son, Joseph. Now, the next part of the story that we're going to look at is Joseph gets to Egypt. He is sold to a man named Potiphar who has a wife, and we're told that the word that's used there, we don't know exactly what it means. We kind of normally translate it as some kind of manager from Potiphar's perspective, but it could mean eunuch, or it could mean he's impotent, something like that, which is influential for the story that we see with Potiphar's wife and Joseph. Joseph comes into Potiphar's house. He's basically put in charge of the entire household by Potiphar because he recognizes Joseph's worth, puts him in charge of the whole household. Tells us that Potiphar's wife takes an interest in Joseph, tries to assault him, attack him, get him to sleep with her. In this picture, and then in the next one here, you see she's tearing at his garment, she uses that later to say, look, he tried to assault me, here's his garment as proof, and then, of course, Joseph is thrown in jail. We don't know, again, the picture we usually have of Potiphar's wife is she's just lustful after Joseph. It says he's handsome, and it says she tries to seduce him. But if Potiphar was impotent or a eunuch, then her only opportunity at children might be Joseph, might be part of the reason she's trying to do this. Or it could be that she's upset that she had previously been in charge of the household, and now Potiphar, her husband, has given that role to Joseph. We don't know, but we do know that she's the only woman in Genesis who is a trickster that the author of Genesis does actually show some sort of judgment on. That because she does this out of selfishness, her trickery or deception is not viewed well. We look at, Lot's daughters, essentially sexually assaulting him to have children. We look at Rebekah's deception. We look at Rachel's deception. All these women who are in the narratives kind of tricksters, the author certainly doesn't condemn them, almost shows why it was a good thing they did what they did. Potiphar's wife is the lone exception of a woman in Genesis who uses trickery that is not shown much sympathy by the author of Genesis here. So Joseph is put in prison. He's there with a couple other guys who had been in the royal court of the Pharaoh of Egypt. They have a couple dreams. Joseph interprets the dreams for him and says, hey, this is what they mean. One of those guys gets out of prison, goes back to the royal court. Later on, Joseph has, here's the two guys' dreams, what they're having here. Later on, Pharaoh has a dream and sends for everybody throughout Egypt to come tell him what these dreams mean, and nobody can. And then all of a sudden, that guy who was back in the royal court says, oh man, I forgot about this guy Joseph. When I was in prison, he interpreted a dream for me. You should go get him. So Pharaoh has Joseph brought up to the royal court. Joseph, of course, interprets the dream for him, tells him what it means. Tell him there's a famine coming. They should start stockpiling food. Interprets the dream for him. As a result, Pharaoh, of course, puts Joseph in charge of basically everything. We often call him like the prime minister, the second in command only to Pharaoh. Joseph at this point has incredible power in Egypt. Are there any questions or comments on that part of Joseph's story? The men what? Willing victims? Yeah, you mean the men that got tricked? Yeah, certainly. I think she said that the men were willing victims. And yeah, certainly I think the author of Genesis would agree with you in the sense that they were willing victims in the sense that they weren't going to do what they need to be done. The author of Genesis always pictures those women as they did what had to be done, specifically the ones who are trying to continue the promise that God had given them, and they felt it's up to me to make sure this happens, whereas the men weren't doing what they were supposed to do. And so I think the author would agree with you there. Any other question or comment just about the first part of Joseph's story? Yeah. I don't ever see much about, the question was, have Egyptologists been able to identify which Pharaoh this is in this story? I don't ever see much about this Pharaoh being identified as I do the Pharaoh in the story with Moses in the Exodus. That one, in fact, there's a lot of Egyptologists and archaeologists who think that they actually have the remains of that Pharaoh. And if you go to the Egypt, the Cairo Museum, or the Egypt Museum in Cairo, it's not like on display or something, but it's there. Like, if you have a certain level of access, you can actually go and see the remains of the Pharaoh that Moses interacted with, which was pretty unique. But I don't usually see much about them trying to make a contention for the remains or anything else about identifying the Pharaoh in this story. So we skipped the story. We went from chapter 37 to chapter 39 to chapter 40 to chapter 41 in Joseph's story. We skipped a story in chapter 38. It says, at that time, Judah left his brothers and went down to stay with a man of Adullam named Hira. Married Canaanite women, showed total disregard for Jacob, his father Jacob's feelings. So the story is the brothers are upset. They're going to throw Joseph in a pit. Judah says, hey, let's not throw him in a pit. Let's sell him. And they sell him off to these people taking him off to Egypt. Then it says, at that time, Judah left his brothers. And it launches in this story about Judah, which is a weird, all of a sudden, aside. It's a weird insertion of this story about Judah in the middle of the Joseph story. Like, right after this story we're going to look at right now, it jumps right back into Joseph's stories where we took it, with Potiphar's wife, and then the guys in prison with him, and then Pharaoh's dreams, and then interpreting those dreams, and then being put in charge of all of Egypt. Slotted right in there by the author of Genesis is this story about Judah. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, his second son, sleep with your brother's wife and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother. This is something that was practiced. It was called the Levirate law. And essentially what that means is if there's a brother and he's married and he dies before he has children, it's the responsibility of another brother to get that brother's wife pregnant, and whatever son is born to her would be considered the dead brother's son, even though biologically it's the son of the brother. So that's kind of where this story starts. Judah finds a wife named Tamar for his oldest son. We don't know why God's upset with him and basically puts him to death, but he does. And so Judah's like, hey, Onan, you're up next. You got to fulfill this law, this promise for your brother. And so it says, sleep with your brother's wife, fulfill this duty. But Onan knew that his second son, Onan knew that the child would not be his. So he refused to fulfill his responsibility. Literally, it says he spills his seed on the ground. So there's your X-rated story again coming in here. But that's he doesn't fulfill what he's supposed to be doing, which is getting her pregnant. What he did was wicked in the Lord's sight, so the Lord put him to death also. So Judah then says to his daughter-in-law Tamar, live as a widow in your father's household until my son Shelah grows up. So he's got a third son. Judah's got a third son, Shelah. He's lost two. He's got a third one, but he's young. So he says to Tamar, go back and live with your dad for a while. When my son Shelah grows up, then you can marry him and have children with him. So Tamar goes to live in her father's household. It reminds me of there's a story of this woman. She's had 4 husbands. They've all died, kind of mysteriously. She is in court being questioned by the attorneys, and they say, well, what happened to your first husband? And she says, well, he died of mushroom poisoning. And they say, well, what happened to your second husband? Well, he died of mushroom poisoning also. They say, well, what happened to your third husband? Well, he also died of mushroom poisoning. They say, what happened to your fourth husband? And he's like, oh, he died of a fractured skull. And the lawyer says, how'd that happen? He said, he didn't really like mushrooms. So this is what Judah's worried about. He's worried that Tamar's got some kind of curse on her or something else, that he's like, I've lost 2 sons already. And here's my 3rd son. I don't want to lose him too. So he does an incredibly immoral and unethical thing and sends her away to live back with her father. That is not what was supposed to happen in that day and age. It was Judah's responsibility to look after her. She had married one of his sons. It's his responsibility, and that Judah's family's responsibility to make sure she's looked after. But instead, he kind of shames her by sending her back to her father's household instead. Kind of an unthinkable thing to do at that time. So verse 12, it says, after a long time, Judah's wife, the daughter of Shua, died. When Judah had recovered from his grief, he went up to Timnah. Let me go on to this next picture here. When Tamar was told, your father-in-law is on his way to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's clothes, covered herself with a veil to disguise herself, then sat down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that though Shelah had now grown up, she had not been given to him as his wife. So Judah didn't keep his promise. He said, go live with your father, kind of a disgraceful thing to make her do. I'll let you know when Shelah's grown up and you can marry him. But by this point, she sees that Shelah's grown up and she has not been called by Judah to come marry him like was supposed to happen. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. Not realizing that she was his daughter-in-law, he went over to her by the roadside and said, come now, let me sleep with you. And what will you give me to sleep with you, she asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, he said. Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? What pledge should I give you? Your seal and its cord and the staff in your hand, she answered. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she became pregnant by him. It's a little fun. The seal and cord is kind of like, she said, give me your passport. Give me your driver's license. They are identifying, items that this seal and this cord that she asked for. Because he says, I'm going to give you a goat. That's worth a lot. That's a fair exchange to let me sleep with you. And she says, well, I don't know you. You're a stranger. Like, why would I just trust you're going to send a goat? What are you going to give me right now kind of as collateral? He says, here's my passport, my driver's license, my credit card, whatever it is. Here's my seal and my cord. So she gives him to that. He sleeps with her. She becomes pregnant by him. It's interesting for the author of Genesis right here, the means of deception. Because notice this is the 3rd in a series of deceptions, and they all use the same physical items, the same physical props. Remember that when Jacob deceives his father Isaac, what is used but a goat and clothing? The goat is the meal. The goat hair covers his arms. He puts on Esau's clothes. It's a goat and clothing that is used here. When Joseph is sold, the props again are goats and clothing. They take his coat, his clothing, kill a goat, put its blood on him, and go to their father and say, check out this coat. Do you recognize whose coat this is, covered in blood? Now again, the means of deception, the physical props, are a goat and clothing. That Tamar here has put on different clothing. The goat was the exchange that's supposed to take place. So another, this 3rd in a line of deceptions that's happening here, all by the same physical props. And now it's Judah who's being kind of duped with this. And it's 3 generations in a row. It's Jacob tricking his father Isaac. A generation, it's, Jacob, the one who tricked his father Isaac, being tricked with the goat and the clothing. Now 1 generation later, his son Judah is being tricked with a goat and clothing. Verse 19 of chapter 38, after she left, she took off her veil and put on her widow's clothes again. Meanwhile, Judah sent the young goat with his friend in order to get his pledge, his seal and cord, his passport back from the woman, but he didn't find her. When he asked the men who lived there, where's that shrine prostitute who was sitting here? They said, there hasn't been any shrine prostitute here. So he went back to Judah and said, I didn't find her. Besides, the men who lived there said there hasn't been any shrine prostitute there. Then Judah said, well, let her keep what she has, or we'll become a laughing stock. So he's not going to go around saying, hey, have you seen a prostitute that has my passport? You know, like, have you seen somebody like that? He knows he'd become a laughing stock if they did that. So he says, well, just let her keep it. After all, I sent her this goat, but you didn't find her. 3 months later, Judah is told, your daughter-in-law Tamar is guilty of prostitution, and as a result, she is now pregnant. Judah said, bring her out and have her burned to death. So in that day and age, the punishment was stoning to death. The fact that Judah's calling for her to be burned to death is certainly an escalation of that. You know, it's just something above and beyond what even the law would have called for at the time, that he's upset. Hey, your daughter-in-law Tamar, she prostituted herself, now she's pregnant, and he says, bring her out, let's burn her to death here. As she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law. I am pregnant by the man who owns these, she said, and she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff and passport and driver's license and Visa card this is. Obviously he recognizes them. There's some similar wording here with the story with Joseph in chapter 37, when the brothers take his blood-covered coat back to their father, and now what's happening here. The author is using the same words and phrases. And they sent and they said, please examine. Then he examined it and said. That's the brothers bringing the coat back to their father Jacob. And now in the story of Judah and Tamar, and she sent, saying, please examine. Then Judah examined this and said. Here's the other thing about these two stories. Joseph's brothers took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this, examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. In Hebrew, it literally says, take note, please, whose these are. Now, in the story of Judah and Tamar, as she was being brought out, she sent a message to her father-in-law, I am pregnant by the man who owns these. And she added, see if you recognize whose seal and cord and staff these are. In the Hebrew, it says, take note, please, whose these are. The exact same phrase is used in both stories of Joseph and his brothers taking the coat back to Jacob, and now Tamar presenting these things to Judah. Judah recognized them, of course, and said, she is more righteous than I, since I wouldn't give her to my son Shelah, and he did not sleep with her again. So here's the funny thing. I've mentioned numerous times, the women in the book of Genesis there's 6 of them at least that you can kind of call tricksters or deceivers. And all except Potiphar's wife, it's kind of just like, I don't condemn this, but it worked out great. The story of Judah and Tamar is different. She's actually commended for what she did. You know, look at what Judah says about her. She is more righteous than I. In Hebrew, it's kind of like, she is more in the right than I. So it's not just like, we could take the English, she is more righteous than I, and just like, she's a better person than I am. But he says it more emphatically. She is more in the right. In other words, like, legally speaking, ethically speaking, morally speaking, theologically speaking, from God's perspective, she's in the right, I'm in the wrong. Now, Judah could have handled this very differently. He could have been like, I don't know whose passport that is. I don't know whose seal and cords that is. Get the fire going, we're burning her to death. And think, hey, this is going to save me from being a laughingstock. I don't got to give her to my third son Shelah and risk him dying. So he could have handled it very differently. But Judah says, she's right, I'm wrong. And when the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. As she was giving birth, one of them put out his hand. So the midwife took a scarlet thread and tied it on his wrist and said, this one came out first. But when he drew back his hand, his brother came out, and she said, so this is how you have broken out. And he was named Perez. Then his brother, who had the scarlet thread on his wrist, came out, and he was named Zerah. Now, if we know anything about the author of Genesis or these stories, we can guess that the son who came out second, the younger of the brothers, is likely to be the favored brother or the brother who is going to continue the promise. But why this soap opera, in the middle of Joseph's story? Why is it just inserted here in such an odd way? Again, we have Joseph is telling his brothers about his dreams. They're upset. They're going to throw him in a pit. No, let's not. Judah says, don't throw him in the pit. Let's sell him. They sell him off to Egypt. And then all of a sudden, this story of Judah and Tamar, then it picks Joseph's story right back up. He's in Potiphar's house. Potiphar's wife is chasing him. He's thrown in prison. He interprets dreams. He interprets Pharaoh's dreams. He's put in charge of all of Egypt. But right there in the middle of Joseph's story is this story of Judah and Tamar. To understand it, we have, from the author's perspective, we have to really continue Joseph's story, which is that he's in charge. The famine has now hit the land. Jacob sends his sons, except for Benjamin, to Egypt to get food. So the brothers go there. They encounter Joseph. Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. He asks them, hey, do you have any other brothers at home? And probably looking back on this, they think we probably should have just said no. But they say, oh, yeah, we got one other brother. So he says, go back and get him. And then you can have the food that you need. So go back and get your youngest brother, Benjamin. So they go back and they talk to Jacob here, who is holding Benjamin, and they say, we gotta bring him back with us, or we're not going to get any food. So they basically come back to Jacob and say, we have to take Benjamin with us. The choices are take Benjamin with us and get food and live, or don't take Benjamin with us and we get no food and we starve to death. Those are the two options that Jacob is presented with, and he says at first he will not send Benjamin. Why won't he send Benjamin? Now, normally we just think, well, he loved the kid. Of course, it was kind of his favorite, which is partly true. But what is Jacob worried about? Remember what he said when Laban came and found Rachel, and he said, if you find anyone with your household gods, they'll surely die. Now, Rachel was sitting on the household gods. It's very likely and possible Joseph was sitting on her lap. Now, she gives birth to Benjamin not long later, so she might be pregnant with Benjamin. And this is in Jewish tradition, she has both children with her. Now he's watched Rachel die pretty soon after. He's lost his son Joseph, and Jacob all along probably thinks, this is all my fault. If I had never said that, it wouldn't have cost me Rachel. It wouldn't have cost me Joseph. I'm not making the same mistake again and sending Benjamin. I can't let him die and have that be on my head as well. But of course, who speaks up but Judah? Judah says, Dad, I promise you I'm going to bring him back. If I don't bring him back, it's my fault. It's on me. So they go back to Joseph in Egypt, and he gives them food, sends them on their way. But pretty soon along comes this servant from the household of their brother Joseph, who they don't know is their brother at this point. And he says, hey, somebody stole a silver cup from us. They're like, why would we do that? The first time you sent us away and we found valuable items, we brought them back to you. Why would we now steal a silver cup? And what do they say? But if anyone's found with the silver cup, they'll die. Let them die. So of course they go through one by one, each brother's sack full of wheat and everything. And where do they find the silver cup that Joseph had his servant hid there purposely? In Benjamin's. So now the brothers are distraught. They go back to Joseph and they're begging for his mercy. And who is it that stands up and sits with Joseph and talks with him about this? It's Judah. And Judah says to Joseph, your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One of them went away from me, and I said, he has surely been torn to pieces, talking about Joseph. And I have not seen him since. If you take this one from me too, and harm comes to him, you will bring my gray head down to the grave. So Judah says to Joseph, your servant, I guaranteed the boy's safety to my father. And I said, if I don't bring him back to you, I will bear the blame before you, my father, all my life. Now then, please let your servant, let me stay here as your slave in place of the boy, in place of Benjamin, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? Do not let me see the misery that would come on my father. So here's Judah The story that got interjected with Judah and Tamar happens right after they sold Joseph into slavery. But this is now much later. Remember, Judah has had sons. One of the, couple been married to Tamar. That whole story has happened at this point. Judah has lost 2 sons at this point. So he knows what his father is going to go through if he loses a second son. And it's changed Judah. There's been a change of character with Judah, that he would approach, Joseph in this way. He's a changed man. The first time, he accidentally saves Joseph's life by saying, let's not throw him in the pit, let's sell him. And that was out of pure selfishness. He just wanted the money. Now, out of pure unselfishness, it's Judah who volunteers to be put into slavery in place of one of his brothers. So it's Judah, not really Joseph, who actually brings about this reconciliation, this resolution of the story. Because at this point, remember, Joseph still hasn't told them who he is. But at this point, Joseph can hold it in no longer. Because of Judah's actions and Judah's words, he now sends everybody out except his brothers and tells them who he is, embraces them. Not surprising that they're probably shocked at what has happened here. Here's some kind of reconciliation pictures there. So the brothers go back, they get Jacob, tell him everything that had happened. They bring him back to Egypt, like Joseph said, go get him, bring the whole family here back to Egypt. You'll be cared for. We'll live in this land, we'll prosper in this land. Joseph at this point has married an Egyptian woman and has 2 sons named Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is older, Ephraim's younger. And again, if following our story, we probably know where this is headed. So when it comes time for Jacob, who's close to his deathbed, to give blessings, he calls Ephraim and Manasseh to him, but he crosses his arms. You can see the arms you can kind of make it on this picture. His arms are crossed, and his son Joseph tries to correct him, like, no, Manasseh's the older one. He's the one that's supposed to get the blessing because he's older, and Ephraim's younger. And basically, Jacob says, yeah, I know, and crosses and says, Ephraim, the younger, will be the one to get the blessing and continue the promise. Interestingly, like Jewish families on Shabbat night, the Sabbath night, when they give the blessing over the daughters, over the girls, they say, may God make you like the matriarchs, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. But when it comes to the sons in the Jewish household, they say, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. They don't say, may God make you like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They say, may he make you like Ephraim and Manasseh. That's because really, for the first time in our story of Genesis, Ephraim and Manasseh don't fight. They don't have animosity between the brothers, and that's Ephraim and Manasseh. So that's why they say, let the sons and let the boys be like Ephraim and Manasseh. So now, in our final part of the story in Genesis, we have Jacob blessing his sons. And following the pattern of Genesis, we'd expect the blessing to go to a younger son. We'd expect it to be a son of, Jacob's beloved Rachel. So the whole story, 25% of the entire book of Genesis is spent basically on Joseph. So it would only be logical for Joseph to be the one to receive the blessing, to receive the promise. If not him, then Benjamin. That's what we'd expect. When not Reuben, he's the firstborn, so we're like, yeah, he's not going to get it. We've seen the pattern. He's not going to be the one. But it's not Simeon, it's not Levi, it's not any other brothers, not even Joseph or Benjamin. It's not the firstborn, the secondborn, the thirdborn. It's not the 11th born. It's not the 12th born. It's the 4th born, Judah. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, Judah. You were turned from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he to whom it belongs shall come, and the obedience of the nations shall be his. And in fact, Judah is the ancestor of 30 kings. 30 kings are going to come. Now, Judah's son, Perez, the one that he had with Tamar after thinking she was a prostitute, is an ancestor along with, if you think back to Lot's daughters, it was their sons, the Moab, who was the ancestor of Ruth. And it's in Matthew's genealogy. He says, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. So Jesus is not the lion of Reuben. He's not the lion of Simeon. He's not the lion of Levi. He's not the lion of Joseph. And Jesus is not the lion of Benjamin. Jesus is called the Lion of Judah, the lion from the tribe of Judah. Yeah.
I just grabbed this shirt. I didn't know you were going to preach on this. So we have the Lion of Judah and the Lamb that was slain. I just changed my shirt. I went to the beach today. I just put this on. I didn't know you were teaching that.
Very fitting. It's perfect. And indeed, in the book of Revelation, then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. So this name for Jesus, the Lion of Judah, again, we would expect, if it's not going to be Reuben, maybe it's the second-born, maybe it's the third-born. No, it wouldn't be them. It's going to be the beloved sons, Joseph or Benjamin. Just like it was Isaac the beloved, just like it was Jacob the beloved, we would expect it to be Joseph or Benjamin. But it's not. Jesus comes from the house and line of Judah. And that's the same house and line of David. So when it says the scepter will not pass from you, for the listener and reader, they know that the scepter, the kingship, the dynasty continues all the way to David, an ancestor of Ruth the Moab, the son of Lot and his daughters, and through Judah, the man who slept with his daughter-in-law like she was a prostitute. David was a result of that, and Jesus is a result of that. And it's so unique that in Matthew's genealogy, he tells us about these women. And he also mentions Rahab. He also mentions Bathsheba, Uriah's wife. So, again, it's one of those things like my professor. People you would not want to include in your family history, Matthew includes. And to tell us the same thing about Jesus that the author of Genesis is telling us about this dysfunctional family. Maybe we don't like them. Maybe we don't agree with what they're doing, but God can use them. We started out this class and looking at, Genesis by talking about God creating something from nothing. We looked at stories, with Hagar and Sarah and Ishmael, and Hagar saying, you are the God who sees me. Lot's daughters, of course, that we mentioned, Judah and Tamar. And starting off with the author of Genesis telling us, God creates something from nothing. God turns nobodies into somebodies. And then proceeds to tell us exactly the stories of a bunch of nobodies that God turned into somebodies. In 1 Corinthians, Paul tells us, take a good look, friends, at who you were when you got called into this life. I don't see many of the brightest and the best among you. Not many influential, not many from high society families. Isn't it obvious that God deliberately chose men and women that the world overlooks and exploits and abuses? God chose the nobodies. And then when God wants to use somebody, he often turns to the nobodies. That's what these stories are about. That's what Genesis is about. That's what the Bible is about, that God takes ordinary people and accomplishes extraordinary things. It happened in their lives. It can happen in our lives, and that's what the author of Genesis wants us to understand. There's going to be a natural separation that happens over and over again between us and God and us with each other. But God is working through all of us to bring reconciliation and unity, not just amongst each other, but with us and to him. And how does he do that? But by turn nobodies into somebodies. So the story of creation that we started out with is not just the story about, the beginning of time. It's about the beginning of you. It's about the beginning of us. If anyone is in Christ, they are a new creation. The old has gone, the new has come. You may feel like a nothing, but you mean something to the Creator. You may feel like a nobody, but the one who created the heavens and the earth thinks you're somebody. And the story of the creation is the story of you. It's the story of us, that God creates something from nothing and turns nobodies into somebodies. He turns nobodies like us into somebodies like him. So we'll close just with this quote I showed you the first week. God created the world out of nothing. So as long as we are nothing, he can make something out of us. And God chooses to use the nobodies and those of us who sometimes feel like nothing. God chooses to use us to create something from nothing and bring his promises to this world. So I appreciate you guys being here. We went a few minutes over. I do just want to say, talking about the first week and this week with Jacob wrestling God, I told you the first week, this class was going to be a wrestling with Scripture. And I just appreciate, I'm so grateful to all of you who have been here, whether it was every week or just tonight or just one of the other weeks, if you're watching this later on Zoom. I'm so grateful that you came ready to wrestle with Scripture. There's probably some things I told you or said or my interpretation of Genesis or Scripture that you didn't particularly like or agree with, but you came here ready to wrestle, and ready to wrestle with Scripture. I hope that our 6 weeks together and looking at Genesis has just helped you see the value in wrestling with Scripture. And, I mentioned the first week that oftentimes as Christians, we ask questions because we want an answer. And there's not really anything wrong with that, but Jewish people often look at Scripture and they ask questions for the question's sake. That's why we get questions like, did Abraham and Sarah divorce? I know some of you probably didn't like that topic, but they ask questions like that. So I hope that you take this and not just with the book of Genesis, but other Scripture that you're listening to in a sermon on Sunday morning or looking at in your own time in personal devotions, and just you come to Scripture ready to wrestle, ready to see what God has in store for you. So thank you again for being here these 6 weeks. Oops.
Can we continue? Yeah. Yeah, again and again.
I guess next summer if we do these.
Oh, great, great. Thank you, Matt. This has